Amina was a young girl with big dreams. She had always imagined a future filled with possibilities, education, independence, and perhaps, one day, love. But dreams rarely survived in a world where duty came before desire. Born into a financially struggling family, she understood the weight of expectations placed upon her shoulders. Her parents, loving but desperate, saw her not as a girl with aspirations, but as their only hope for a better future. When the proposal came from Mr. Zubair, a wealthy businessman nearly 3 times her age, her family saw it as a blessing, a secure future, a life of luxury and stability, things they had never known. Amina, however, felt only dread. She had barely turned 18, her heart unprepared for a life bound to a man she barely knew. She pleaded with her parents, hoping they would see the sorrow in her eyes, but their decision was final. The wedding preparations began immediately. Gold jewelry, embroidered dresses, and lavish arrangements filled the house, but none of it felt real to Amina. The women in the family praised her luck, whispering about how fortunate she was to marry into wealth. No one asked her what she wanted. No one noticed the silent tears she wiped away each night. On the wedding day, she sat before the mirror, her reflection foreign to her own eyes. The heavy bridal attire, the elaborate makeup, it all felt like a mask. As she walked toward the stage where Mr. Zubair waited, she felt the walls closing in around her. His face was calm, unreadable. He was not cruel, not unkind, but he was not the man she had imagined for herself. As the marriage vows were spoken, Amina felt her last bit of freedom slipping away. The applause, the celebrations, the endless congratulations, all of it blurred together. She was no longer just Amina. She was now someone's wife. The reality of her new life settled like a weight on her chest. No matter how much she wanted to resist, destiny had already made its choice for her. The wedding was nothing short of a grand spectacle. The hall glittered with golden chandeliers. The scent of fresh roses filled the air, and hundreds of guests admired the lavish decorations. Laughter and music surrounded Amina, but she felt none of it. To the world, she was the luckiest girl, stepping into a life of wealth and privilege. But to her, it was nothing less than a beautifully decorated prison. As she walked onto the stage, draped in layers of silk and gold, all eyes were on her. Women whispered about her beauty, men nodded in approval at the match, and cameras flashed relentlessly. She felt like an object on display, admired yet completely detached from the moment. Her heart pounded as she approached the man she was now bound to, Mr. Zubair. He stood there in his finely tailored suit, a man of power and presence, but there was no warmth in his gaze. He was not unkind, not intimidating, but he was distant. His polite nod, his careful words, his measured smile, everything about him seemed controlled, as if he were simply fulfilling a duty rather than embracing a new beginning. When he reached for her hand, she felt the coldness of his touch, not from his skin, but from the emptiness between them. The ceremony dragged on, each ritual sealing her fate further. Amina sat beside him, nodding when expected, smiling when necessary, but inside, she felt like a ghost in her own body. Her family beamed with pride, her mother's eyes glistening with relief, her father standing taller than she had ever seen him. They had done their part. They had secured her future. As the night went on, Amina stole glances at Mr. Zubair. He was surrounded by guests, accepting congratulations, but never once looking truly happy. There was something in his eyes, something heavy, something buried. It wasn't just her who felt trapped in this marriage. He did too. For a brief moment, Amina wondered if destiny had forced them both into this arrangement. 2 strangers tied together by circumstances neither of them had chosen. But that thought brought no comfort. Because no matter what he felt, no matter what secrets his eyes held, her reality remained unchanged. She was now his wife, and there was no turning back. Amina's new home was nothing short of a palace. Every corner of the mansion spoke of wealth. marble floors that shone like glass, towering chandeliers that cast golden light, and halls so vast that her footsteps echoed when she walked alone. And she was always alone. Days passed in silence, broken only by the quiet shuffling of servants who catered to her every need, yet never truly acknowledged her. They called her Madam with deep respect, but it felt hollow, as if she were just another part of the grand household's decor. No warmth, no real connection, just duty. Mr. Zubair, her husband, remained a mystery. He was neither cruel nor affectionate. He provided her with everything: jewelry, designer clothes, anything money could buy, but never his time, never his thoughts. Their conversations were brief, polite, and distant. He asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, but never about her dreams, her fears, or her heart. It was as if they were strangers sharing the same space, bound by a contract rather than a bond. Nights were the hardest. She dined at a long, elegant table meant for a dozen guests, yet it was only the two of them. He ate in silence, absorbed in his own thoughts, and she, too afraid to speak, played with her food, counting the minutes until she could retreat to her room. But as the emptiness of her days stretched on, something began to change in her. She started noticing things, small details that felt out of place. A particular door at the end of the west wing, always locked. The way Mr. Zubair's eyes lingered on it when he passed. The servant's sudden silence whenever she asked about it. Curiosity grew inside her like a quiet storm. What was behind that door? Why did it seem so forbidden? And why, in a house so grand, so full of luxury, did it feel like there were ghosts lingering in the shadows? The mansion was beautiful, but beauty could not fill the void in her heart. She was not a wife, not a companion, just a lonely soul trapped in a gilded cage. And no matter how much gold surrounded her, a cage was still a cage. Amina could no longer ignore the locked room at the end of the west wing. It stood there like a secret begging to be uncovered, a mystery that clung to the air of the mansion. She had tried asking the servants about it, but they always hesitated, offering vague responses before quickly changing the subject. Even Mr. Zubair, usually indifferent to her questions, had given her a look that warned her to leave it alone. But she couldn't. One evening, when the mansion was quiet and Mr. Zubair had retired to his study, Amina found herself standing before the door once more. Her fingers traced the antique doorknob, and to her surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room frozen in time. The scent of old wood and faded perfume lingered in the air. Dust clung to untouched furniture, a small writing desk, an armchair by the window, and a bookshelf filled with aging books. Amina's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the single-framed photograph on the nightstand. A woman. She was beautiful, with delicate features and dark, soulful eyes. Amina had never seen her before, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her presence in this room. Beneath the photo lay a small, worn-out diary. With trembling hands, Amina picked it up and opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant, soft yet firm. June 12th, 1995. Today, Zubair held my hand for the first time, and I felt like the whole world had stopped. Amina's breath hitched. This was no ordinary journal. This was the voice of someone who had once meant everything to Mr. Zubair. Page after page, the story unfolded before her eyes. The woman in the photo was Layla, Mr. Zubair's first love. They had been inseparable, bound by a love so deep it had shaped his entire existence. The words painted a picture of passion, stolen moments, whispered promises of forever. But as Amina turned to the final entries, her chest tightened. August 3rd, 1997. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. Zubair holds my hand every night, whispering that I will be fine. But I know the truth. I know I'm slipping away, and I fear what will become of him when I am gone. Layla had died young. Amina stared at the diary, her fingers gripping the pages as a wave of emotions crashed over her. He had never moved on. This marriage, this life, none of it had been about her. She was never meant to be a wife in his heart, only a presence to fill the emptiness Layla had left behind. Tears blurred her vision as the weight of the truth settled deep within her. She had felt out of place before, but now she understood why. She was living in the shadow of a love that had never died, and no matter how much time passed, she would never be able to compete with the ghost of Layla. The evening of the charity gala was one of the rare occasions when Amina was expected to make a public appearance as Mrs. Zubair. Dressed in an elegant but modest gown, she walked beside her husband, who, as always, was polite yet distant. The grand ballroom was filled with high-profile guests, businessmen and socialites, all exchanging pleasantries, their laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers. But Amina felt like a spectator in someone else's world. She stood quietly near the refreshment table, watching as Mr. Zubair engaged in conversation with other men of his stature. No one approached her. She had learned by now that she was merely a silent extension of her husband, a presence acknowledged but never truly seen. And then, a voice broke through her solitude. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys these events." Amina turned to find a young man standing beside her. He was tall, well-dressed, but unlike the others in the room, there was something refreshing about him. His features were sharp, his eyes warm, and there was an ease in his posture that made him seem out of place among the rigid formality of the event. "I don't," she admitted softly, surprised at herself for answering so honestly. He smiled. "Neither do I. I'm only here because my hospital is one of the beneficiaries of tonight's fundraiser." Amina's curiosity piqued. "You're a doctor." "Zayan," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Pediatric surgeon." She hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, his touch carrying a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. They began talking, and for the first time in years, Amina felt like she was having a conversation that wasn't hollow. Zayan didn't treat her like a fragile ornament or a mere extension of her husband. He spoke to her as a person, as someone with thoughts and feelings. He asked about her interests, her opinions, her dreams. And even though she had buried those parts of herself for so long, his kindness made her want to remember them. At one point, he noticed the distant look in her eyes and said, "You seem lost." Amina blinked, startled by his observation. No one had ever asked her how she felt. No one had ever noticed. Before she could respond, Mr. Zubair's presence cast a shadow over them. He had finished his conversations and was now ready to leave. Amina quickly stepped back, instinctively falling into the role of the obedient wife. "It was nice meeting you, Amina," Zayan said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, as if he sensed the walls she had rebuilt around herself. She nodded, unable to say more, as she followed Mr. Zubair out of the ballroom. But as she sat in the back seat of the car, staring out of the window at the city lights, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she had felt alive again. At first, Amina and Zayan's meetings were purely coincidental. Brief encounters at charity events, chance run-ins at the bookstore, or polite greetings at the hospital, where she had started volunteering to escape the loneliness of the mansion. But soon, coincidence turned into intention. Their conversations grew longer, their smiles warmer. Amina found herself looking forward to these moments. To the way Zayan listened when she spoke, to the way his laughter made her forget the weight she carried. With him, she wasn't just Mrs. Zubair. She was Amina, a person with thoughts, feelings, and desires of her own. Yet, with every stolen moment, guilt crept in like a shadow. She was a married woman. No matter how distant Mr. Zubair was, no matter how empty their marriage felt, she belonged to him. And yet, here she was, finding solace in another man's presence. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave for the hospital, Mr. Zubair's voice stopped her. "You've been going out a lot lately." His tone was calm, but his sharp gaze pinned her in place. Amina's heart pounded. He had never questioned her whereabouts before, never even cared enough to ask. But now, there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't decipher. I started volunteering," she said carefully. "It gives me something to do." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's good." But there was an unspoken warning in his voice. That night, as Amina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind battled itself. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet the way her heart raced when she thought of Zion told her otherwise. Did she even deserve to feel this way? Did she have the right to seek happiness when she had vowed herself to a man who had given her a life of luxury? She turned to face the darkness, whispering the question to herself. What if happiness was never meant for me? The day Mr. Zubair collapsed, everything changed. It happened so suddenly. One moment he was reading in his study. The next, Amina heard a heavy thud, followed by the frantic shouts of the servants. She rushed in to find him slumped over his desk, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The hospital was a blur of white coats, flashing monitors, and hurried whispers between doctors. Amina stood beside his bed, watching as the man she had spent months resenting lay unconscious, looking frail and vulnerable for the first time. She should have felt something more: fear, sorrow, desperation. But all she felt was suffocation. As the hours passed, she remained by his side, her hands folded in her lap, her mind in turmoil. She had been trapped in this marriage for so long, pretending to be a devoted wife, hiding her loneliness behind a mask of obedience. But in this quiet room, with no one to judge her, the truth spilled out. "You don't love me, and I don't love you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "We were never meant to be, and yet here we are, tied together by fate." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words. "I've tried to be the wife you deserve, but I can't keep pretending. I feel like I'm suffocating in this life, in this house, in this marriage." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. "I wish I could be happy here. I really do. But I'm not." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Then, a soft inhale. Amina froze. She turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs as she met Mr. Zubair's eyes. They were open, weak, filled with exhaustion, but unmistakably awake. And worst of all, filled with heartbreak. He had heard everything. The atmosphere in the mansion was different when Mr. Zubair returned home from the hospital. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. Amina knew a conversation was coming, one she wasn't prepared for. That evening, he called her to his study. She hesitated at the door before stepping inside, her heart hammering. He sat in his chair, looking weaker than before, his usual air of authority replaced with something unfamiliar: vulnerability. "Sit," he said quietly. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studying her, as if memorizing her face. Then he sighed. "I heard everything you said at the hospital." Amina's breath caught. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sadness in it. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at this house, at me, as if you're trapped." He exhaled heavily. "I won't pretend it doesn't hurt, but I won't force you to stay in a life that drains you." She blinked, stunned. This wasn't what she had expected. Mr. Zubair leaned back, his gaze distant. "I've spent my life chasing things that never truly mattered. Wealth, success, status. And in the end, what did it give me? A house too big, a heart too empty." His eyes met hers. "I won't be the reason you feel the same." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. She had dreamed of freedom, of choices, but she had never imagined they would come from the very man she thought would keep her imprisoned forever. "I won't hold you back, Amina," he continued. "If you want to leave, you can." His voice softened. "But if you stay, it has to be because you want to, not because you feel bound by duty." Amina's mind swirled with emotions: relief, guilt, confusion. The door to her future had just been unlocked, but stepping through it was a choice she had never been allowed to make before. For the first time in her life, her destiny was in her hands. That night, the mansion was eerily silent. Amina lay awake in her room, her mind restless. Mr. Zubair's words still echoed in her ears, his regrets, his unexpected offer of freedom. She had spent so long resenting this marriage, dreaming of escape. And now, when the choice was finally hers, she didn't know what she truly wanted. Sometime before dawn, a heavy knock shattered the silence. A servant stood at her door, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Madam, it's Mr. Zubair." Amina felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She rushed to his room, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The moment she stepped inside, she knew. He lay still in his bed, his face peaceful, his chest unmoving. The doctors later confirmed it: a heart attack in his sleep. He never woke up. Despite everything, the sight of him like that, so still, so final, shattered something inside her. She had thought she felt nothing for him, that he had only been a symbol of her imprisonment. But standing there, realizing he was truly gone, she felt hollow in a way she never had before. The days that followed were a blur. The funeral was grand, attended by influential figures who spoke of Mr. Zubair's success, his wealth, his legacy. But no one spoke of the man who had quietly mourned a lost love, the man who had given Amina a choice when she least expected it. When the will was read, she learned she had inherited a significant portion of his wealth. The mansion, the businesses, everything was hers if she chose to keep it. But as she sat in the same study where he had offered her freedom, she realized something painful. She had spent so much time trying to escape him that she had never truly tried to understand him. And now, it was too late. A week after the funeral, the mansion felt emptier than ever. The staff moved carefully around her, their voices hushed, their gazes filled with sympathy. But Amina didn't need their pity. She needed clarity. One evening, while sorting through Mr. Zubair's study, she found a small wooden box in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, folded neatly, was a single envelope with her name written in careful strokes. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. "Amina, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And if I am gone, I want you to know something that I could never say while I was alive. I was never blind to your sorrow. I saw the way you looked at this house, the way you looked at me, not with love, but with duty. It was never your fault. You were too young, and I was too much a man of the past to see how unfair it was to place you in this life. But I need you to know, I was not your captor. I was merely a man bound by fate, just as you were. I too have lived with a love I could never truly have. I have spent years waking up in an empty bed, mourning a ghost, and I would never wish that upon you. I know about Zion. I have seen the way your eyes light up when you speak of him, the way your voice carries warmth when you talk about your time outside these walls. You may feel guilt, but I do not blame you. If I had a chance to love again, I would have taken it too. Amina, you are free, not just because I have left this world, but because I give you my blessing to live as you wish. Do not let my name or my memory chain you to a life you do not want. Be happy. That is all I ask of you. Zubair." The letter slipped from her hands as a sob tore from her throat. She had spent so long seeing him as the villain of her story, but in the end, he had only been another victim of fate, just like her. Tears streamed down her face as she wept, not for the love she never gave him, but for the respect she had only now begun to feel. For the first time in her life, Amina was truly free. No expectations, no duties, no invisible chains tying her to a life she never chose. Yet, as she stood in the vast emptiness of the mansion, she realized something. Freedom was not as simple as she once imagined. The weight of choice was now hers to bear. She met Zayan again, weeks after Mr. Zubair's passing. He was the same, kind, warm, full of life. But something had shifted within her. Where once she might have run into his arms, desperate for an escape, now she hesitated. "I heard about Mr. Zubair," Zayan said softly, concern etched in his features. "I can't imagine what you're going through." Amina smiled faintly. "Neither can I." There was a time when she thought love was the only way out, that Zayan, with his gentle words and compassionate heart, was her salvation. But now, standing before him, she realized she didn't want to be saved. She wanted to discover who she was beyond the confines of marriage, beyond being someone's wife. So, she made a decision. Instead of stepping into another love story, she chose herself. She left the mansion behind, keeping only the wealth she needed to start anew. She traveled to places she had only dreamed of, learned things she had never been allowed to pursue. She studied, read, wrote, and for the first time, followed her own passions instead of living for someone else's expectations. There were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt. But with every step she became stronger. She no longer needed an escape. She had built her own path. One day, love might find her again. But this time, it wouldn't be an escape. It would be a choice. Years passed, and Amina became a woman she never thought she could be. She had traveled, studied, and built a life on her own terms. She was no longer the timid girl forced into a marriage she never wanted. She was independent, confident, and most importantly, free. When she returned to her homeland, it wasn't with sadness or regret, but with peace. The past no longer haunted her. It had shaped her, but it did not define her. One afternoon, while visiting a charity hospital she had helped fund, she saw him again. Zayan. He stood at the far end of the corridor, speaking to a nurse, his presence just as warm as she remembered. When his eyes met hers, time slowed. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he smiled. "Amina." She nodded, a slow smile forming on her lips. "It's been a long time." They sat outside in the garden, talking for hours. Not as two people burdened by guilt and longing, but as equals, as individuals who had grown. Zayan told her about his work, his journey, and she shared hers. There was no desperation between them this time, no need to fill a void. And yet, something was still there. Amina felt it in the way he looked at her, not as someone fragile and in need of saving, but as a woman who had built her own destiny. "I always hoped you'd find your happiness," Zayan said quietly. She took a deep breath, the weight of her past finally lifting. "I have, and I think I'm finally ready to share it." This time, love wasn't an escape. It wasn't fate forcing her into someone's arms. It was her choice, fully and completely. As she reached for his hand, she knew. This was love, on her own terms. On a quiet morning, Amina stood before Mr. Zubair's grave, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. The marble stone bore his name, etched in elegance, a reminder of a man she had once seen as her captor, but had come to understand as something else entirely. She knelt down, running her fingers over the inscription. "I used to think you were the reason I was trapped," she whispered. "But in the end, you were the one who set me free." For years, she had resented the life she was forced into. But now, standing here, she realized that every twist of fate, every pain, every struggle, had shaped her into the woman she was today. Without Mr. Zubair, without the lessons she had learned in that gilded cage, she might have never found the strength to claim her own destiny. She placed a single white flower on the grave. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the marriage, not for the pain, but for the freedom he had given her in the end. As she walked away, she felt no more bitterness, no more regret, only peace. Life had taken away what she thought she wanted, but it had given her what she truly needed: strength, independence, and eventually, love on her own terms. She smiled as she stepped forward into the sun, her heart light, her soul free. Because destiny wasn't something written in stone, it was something we made for ourselves.